Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to another one of our TESS seminars. And as you know, TESS is our Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science here at JCU. And as you've probably heard me say many times, this is really one of our main forums for terrestrial research here. We study rainforests, we study streams, those types of freshwater ecosystems, but we don't really delve into the ocean very much. So that's sort of how we divide things up a little bit. It's really a pleasure to introduce Petra Buergelt. I think I probably butchered her name there, but to join us today as our speaker. She's a psychologist. Okay, now every now and then we try to actually bring in somebody who's just a little bit typical from our not scientists, environmental scientists, whatever, but we like to actually see some of our adjoining realms and how those things can interact with the things we're trying to do. Petra is from Germany originally, and she's subsequently got a PhD in psychology from Massey University in New Zealand. And she's now with the University of Canberra, and the center there is the HEAL Center. I think it's called the HEAL Global Research Center from Canberra. And we really appreciate her coming all the way up here to talk to us today. I've got a list of many accomplishments that she's had. She's well published, she's well funded. You should be paying us, really, rather than us paying you, but anyway. She's received a number of recognitions and awards. And in many ways, she's one of these people who I think I would call an integrator. I may be proven wrong, but she seems to be very transdisciplinary, trying to look at things broadly in a lot of senses to draw connections between things that maybe much of the time we don't think about. So anyway, Petra, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Is that on? Is that good? Yeah, good, awesome. Thanks for the very beautiful introduction and for taking the risk with me and bringing me kind of a little bit in from the side. That's really appreciated. But I hope really with the presentation today that you will see the connection between nature and the social sciences, and not only the social sciences, but the arts as well. So hopefully you will see that. So it's really about resolving our existential crises, including disasters and environmental threats. And I would like to take you a little bit on a journey back into time, into deep time, actually, quite a bit, and moving and within, because from my perspective, this is really what needs to happen to move forward. We need to go back and go within. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you will know what I mean with that. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the traditional owners of not only indigenous peoples, not only in Australia, but actually in the world. And we often forget that indigenous peoples are in the world. And specifically the traditional owners here of this country as well. And pay my deepest respect to all of the past, current and emerging leaders in particular, because as you will come to see, they are very, very vital for our survival. And so I'm very grateful for them to in the case or in the face of a lot of disasters in terms of social disasters in the form of colonialization being thrown at them for many years. So who am I to talk about crises going back in time and within? So let me introduce a little bit so that you can see from the angles I'm coming. Which hopefully will help you to locate them. So I'm actually, from my father's side, I'm coming from Silesia, which is now Poland. And from my mother's side, I come from Saxony. I grew up in East Germany for the first 20 years of my life. And I'm very grateful for that because I have the knowledge of a completely different social system. Socialism wasn't all bad. Actually, a lot of it was good. And it introduced me to living collectively and how to work collectively as well. And I grew up in nature. In fact, actually, I'm a horticulturist by trade. And so that's a little bit the connection to the center. And also, Germans have actually quite a deep appreciation of indigenous peoples. This is how we are educated in Germany. And so we have very much a heart for indigenous peoples. In terms of my background, I am not only in psychology, and by the way, not clinical psychology, we are making that very clear. I'm actually a community, if you want to box me, a community psychologist and eco-psychologist as well, but also have a background in anthropology and sociology, so I'm broader than that. And I traveled a lot. And then I came very much across transformative education and have gone for a lot of transformative education, which brought me to disaster. So my background is disaster risk reduction, disaster recovery preparedness, to make the world a safer place. And then 10 years ago, I had the huge honor and privilege to meet this amazing woman, Professor Aline Larapame-Pilama, who is from Elko Island in a very remote community. And so since 10 years, we have been working very closely together. And then I also met Indigenous peoples in Taiwan, and to have the cross-cultural perspective there as well. So that's all what I'm bringing. But also, this Indigenous team, largely Indigenous team, has tremendously influenced me in my perspective as well. So you're getting today the benefit not only of me, but actually all of those people who contributed to me over the years. So I think I'm not saying anything new when I'm saying humanity is experiencing growing and the compounding existential crises, and it's increasingly personal and painful. We have environmental destruction, climate change, extreme natural events, disasters, global pandemic, mental physical disease, but also a lot of, and increasingly, unfortunately, violence and wars. Just not looking too good. Now, how have we and people in the Western cultures been perceiving crises? Typically like this, right? Now, obviously, this is not going to work, but also another response has been those ones who are a bit more aware have had this response very largely, unfortunately. However, there's also another perspective. And Albert Einstein said, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. Now, the Chinese symbol for crisis actually means danger, absolutely, but also opportunity. And according to Lange, in the point of the greatest instability lies the greatest potential. And so in the context of there's this space for potential that can be difficult to see. Plus there's cultural differences and sensitivities, and it has very much been suppressed, right? So typically we seeing crisis as something bad in our society, but it is actually a huge opportunity. And as John F. Kennedy said, in a crisis, be aware of danger, but recognize the opportunity. So I'm kind of here to present the opportunity and how we can harness that opportunity. So all of those crises are actually giving us feedback. They're giving us, saying us, hold on, stop, pause, something is not working here. So if we could just step a little bit, outside and say, hold on, how did we end up actually in this existential crisis? And also, what are the opportunities we are being given here by those crises? And how can we use those opportunities to actually move forward? Now, Kingsley said, we are actually in a cultural transition, which sounds much more positive, right, than crises. And Gerard Diamond says, to create a new society that works better, the old society actually has to collapse. And I think that's what we are experiencing now. But also we have been trying to address the symptoms. And it's increasingly obvious that this approach is really not working. It's all of our systems are failing, increasing also the destruction of the environment. And as Desmond Tutu said, there comes a point where we need to stop and just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in the first place. If you're really honest with us, is dealing with the symptoms, we will never ever have enough resources, and it's going to be spiraling out, it's going to be worse and worse. So why don't we actually identify the cause so that we don't have to deal with the symptoms, right? Would kind of make sense. So let's go there and say, resolving crisis requires identifying the source. Then the question becomes, what is the source of this existential crisis? And there's mounting literature that it's actually essentially spiritual. Now that is particular for scientists, kind of an area where we are a little bit challenged, shall we say, right? So please bear with me, and I really ask you to try it on. If at the end of the talk you're saying, nah, that does not make sense for me at all, that's completely fine. But please try it on, be open, try it on, and see how we're going with it. So here, if you unpack it a little bit more, it's us living disconnected from nature, including our true divine nature, our sacred nature, and ancient ecological wisdoms, and war that created this disharmony. And this disharmony between nature and us creates actually the ill health and destruction. So how did we then become disconnected from nature, including ourselves and natural laws? And this is where we need to go back in time. Actually, in the West, it has developed gradually over millennia. So we have to really, really go back in a long time. So if you look at the roots of the Western culture, the roots are ancient. And they actually precede Socratic Greek philosophers. Our Western ancestors are actually, they're not primitive as the history which in the West has been written says they are, but they actually possess extensive and deep ancient wisdom. Now, if you think about indigenous wisdom, you might want to draw a bridge there. And they actually also followed orally transmitted lineages of mystics and healers, and then traced those ones back to the Gnostics and Hermeneutic traditions. If you look into what I love as a German, I love looking into the etymology of words. And if you look at Gnostics, it actually means having knowledge and insight. So here comes from the within, going within. The insight is actually directly seeing inwardly and experience our divine nature. And this is when you're talking with indigenous peoples, this is actually what you're finding. Indigenous peoples will increasingly say, if they get a space to say it and to express it, what we have to do is actually returning back to ourselves, to our inner being, and bring out this inner being. This is what we are hearing again and again, talking with indigenous peoples up in the north. And they use ancient transformative techniques of alchemy and magic to carry people over into other states of consciousness that silence those rational thoughts and enabled accessing and becoming conscious of the spiritual realms of our ancestors, and bring from those realms wisdom into our physical world. So again, in the Western science, we are looking mainly at the objective world, right? Not so much at the spiritual world, and this is not objective, it's not measurable, and hence we are kind of pushing it aside. But according to indigenous wisdom and to our Western predecessor, our Western ancestors, this is actually where the gold lies, where the power of us lies, but which we have been disconnected from. And also that is where in the West, in the Western system, we are looking so much for the universal laws, for the universal theories, but you're looking at only in the physical world. Whereas indigenous peoples, as well as our Western ancestors, are saying, no, it's actually in the invisible, in the spiritual world, and this is and that world is expressed in nature. And if that then becomes all out, people are living for others. So rather than in our Western culture now, living for ourselves mainly, right? If we are really living in harmony with ourselves, what follows is that we are living for others and in mutual connections with others, but also living harmoniously with nature, our nature, and nature full stop. So if you are wanting to look also particularly as environmental scientists, if you want to look into how we can shift people from destroying nature into living, supporting and facilitating and taking care of nature, this is where we need to go back to. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but again, bear with me, please. And then also when that happens, there's actually the health and well-being of all creatures and natural processes and being life-giving as well. And again, if you look across indigenous knowledges, not only in Australia, but actually worldwide indigenous knowledges, all their culture and society, the main goal is for everybody, all creatures, including human beings, to live in harmony. And the ancestors are saying, if that happens, when we're living in harmony, everybody will be healthy. Country will be healthy, but also we will be healthy as people. But also natural processes become life-giving. And the really interesting thing is with the indigenous peoples up north, where we're working together for 5 years, one of the things they have been telling us again and again is the cyclones which are now damaging, they used to be life-giving. And they're always saying it's a natural process. It is, we are cyclones are us. And they're actually really important for purifying and for regenerating as well. But they have become destructive. And this is actually the work we are doing now, where we are looking into how come that those natural processes which used to be life-giving, how come that they actually have become life-destroying. Again, looking at the source of everything. So then we could say, well, so given that we actually in the West had not the same, but very similar ancient knowledges, like Australian peoples, for example, have here still, particularly in the North, what happened? How did we lost it? And interestingly, actually, even though we revere Plato and Aristotle, actually, they were in a lineage of those ancestors where they tinkered a bit around with those sacred knowledges they had been given. And they used reason to force our minds to separate from our psyche or soul. And what then in the wake of that over centuries played out is that the Western society became more and more patriarchal, totalitarian, rational, reductionistic, and objective. And that is our Western worldview, largely, commonly, or our predominant worldview in the West. We might not be aware of it, and that's the tricky bit with worldviews, is that we are living and we are acting, but we are acting based on something, and that something is our worldview, what we believe about the reality and what we believe our knowledge. And so this worldview created a culture that gradually domesticated and conditioned us into ways of thinking, living, that disconnected us from our ancestors, from the universal laws, from the way of knowing, from our sacred and divine nature, and from the sacred, invisible, feminine, and spiritual realm. And this is where the source lies. This disconnect and this disharmony. And then the troika of patriarchy, capitalism, and Christian church continued to hinder us reconnecting by deliberately actually destroying the conditions vital for our transformation and for maturing our inner being, our psyche or soul or spirit. And this is, Avatar has been so successful because that this whole, this movie captures so very poignantly our disconnect from nature, and people seeing it really get that we are destroying our own basis for living, basically. And if you come from this perspective, then you will also start come to the understanding that when we are talking about indigenous peoples being colonized, Western people have been colonized as well. but just over centuries, over a much longer time frame. And so for us, it's not as visible anymore. It's kind of has become habitual, and we can't remember. There's indigenous peoples who still very closer to it and still remember and are there. Now, all of those spiritual and we could also say esoteric or occult or magical beliefs or wisdom has been met with contempt by academics. As I said, we basically have written out this side of knowledge completely. But that's commonly because we don't know much about it. And Professor Walter Hangcraft spent 30 years on working out why that actually happened. So he says it has been really expelled from the academy on the basis of Protestant and Enlightened polemics. And then all of those ancient Western traditions, but indigenous people, indigenous wisdom, which we had in the West as well, have been pushed aside. And so he explores in the book also how the impact on it on us in the West, but also as the whole, because we have then started the Western culture then started to colonize the rest. So what's the antidote then? So how can we heal and how can we reconnect? The King said, instead of stepping forward, we actually need to look into the future and looking into the future for solutions. We have to start walking backwards into the place inside of all of us where the answers already lie and have always been waiting. So again, he's referring to our inner being, our soul, our psyche, because that's where our innate wisdom is. And if you think about the word education, it actually means educare. It means bringing out the wisdom from within, not giving wisdom or knowledge, but from within. So really the importance then is for us to remember in the Western culture, to remember and to reconnect with nature and ancient knowledges to restore harmony. And indeed, actually, apocalypse means an uncovering of prophetic revelations of ancient or indigenous knowledges that can enable humanity to engage in transformative journey required for creating a new culture that restores this harmony and balance. So even though we, again, in the Western culture, we have come to see that as something, when we're thinking about apocalypse, we think about something bad, but it's actually something good because it is forcing us to shift. And where we need to, what we need to do is really to transform our worldview towards a matriarchal, metaphysical, spiritual, and holistic, ecological, equal, and subjective worldviews. If we can accomplish that, people will take care again of nature and act in this way. So it's really for us to remember to cultivate and to live according to our own sacred nature and ancestors and the ancestral laws. So then the question becomes, okay, if that's the case, how can we transform our damaging worldviews, which we are having in the West? And this is where transformative learning comes in. Typically, I'm using butterflies from nature to bring home the concept of transformative learning. However, given that your symbol is the frog, frogs are also engaging in metamorphosis, right? So that was really, thank you for that. I can use both now, butterflies and frogs as well. So it's really, transformative learning is more than behavior change. Typically, we are saying for people to take care of nature and stop destroying nature, we need to change their behavior. Actually, what we need to do is we need to change their belief system, and not only change their belief system, but actually completely shift it in a way which they're not falling back anymore. Because behavior change typically means people very much often go back to their old behavior. Transformation goes beyond that. That just like the frog shifts the form, same for transformation. It's just typically we are losing transformation very, very loosely, and typically also interchangeably between transformation and change. But it is actually a permanent shift. And there is a whole literature also on transformative learning, which is again very often overlooked. But according to transformative learning theory, transformation is actually a traumatic and permanent shift which alters people's way of being and seeing themselves in the world and living in a completely new realm. That goes beyond just changing something. It actually completely shifts people in a way where they're seeing something completely different. And so it's an experiencing a deep structural shift of consciousness in thinking, feeling, and acting. So if we are shifting people's worldviews, then we can also they will feel differently and they will act differently. So kind of we had it all the time upside down. And when people are experiencing transformative learning, what happens is they become more expansive, discriminating, and they are able to integrate more. They are not as narrow-minded anymore. They have completely different levels of awareness, authenticity, and responsibility. They're becoming much more themselves and confident to express themselves really authentically, but also to take on responsibility. And that's what we need, right? For people to take care of the environment again and stop destroying it, they need to become responsible. Also, what happens when people are experiencing transformative learning is they're becoming more vital. They're starting to wander again. Remember as children, when you got out of the bed and you was like, wow, what an amazing day. And we went and explored nature and we loved being in nature. Imagine if we can, as adults, come back to that. Also, it shifts how people relate with others and with nature. And that's where we want to go. And people start envisioning different approaches. Now, one of the reasons why people are putting their head in the sand is because, as they're saying, it's too overwhelming. And they can't imagine different ways of being and acting in the world. Transformative learning creates that space for them actually to be able to see alternative approaches. And they're also sensing the possibilities for social justice, peace, and happiness, which increases their ability to change and act, and actually also to come together with other people to create collective actions. And again, that's what we need, right, to make a difference for the environment. The transformation opens the space for open, critically examining, questioning, reflecting on their beliefs and other beliefs, and to start enacting them, and to engage in dialogue and to actually talk with other people, and to refine people from different problems from different perspectives, to revise their beliefs and their actions, to become more responsible, and to take and sustain effective social actions. So all of those things which we need for saving the environment, but also in the face of all of our existential crises. Transformative learning can occur suddenly and unexpectedly and create those profound exchanges. And who of you have experienced aha moments in your life? Yeah? Yeah? Aha moment. Yeah, thank you. Probably most of us, that's transformative learning, because like, wow, suddenly you could say something which, it's something like clicked together suddenly. Transformative learning, epiphanies. Where you say, but I don't know why I didn't see that before. Suddenly there, right? And some people are experiencing awakenings in that, where they're saying, well, suddenly they can a completely different realm opens for them. Now again, brings us back to the Gnostics and having knowledge from within. Because how come that you can suddenly see something? The world hasn't changed out there, right? You have changed, and if you change, then you see a different world. So let's Are you a little bit ready for an experiment or for a transformative experiment? Yeah? Yes? Excited? Thank you very much. It can, it can become a little bit rough maybe, but I promise you, it will make you feel much better afterwards. And Master Yoga said, you must unlearn what you have learned. So I'm inviting you to again be open. And wisdom is letting something go. So you might need to fall back on that. Who of you is seeing black and blue? Now be proud, be proud. 3, 4, 5. Yeah, okay, cool. And who's of you seeing white and gold? Oh, some of you seeing both. Woohoo. So some of you seeing just the white and gold? Yeah? Right. So probably half of you is seeing black and blue, our ones are white and gold. Now those people who are seeing the black and blue, what are you going to say to those white and people who are seeing white and gold? They're blind, right? They're absolutely blind. I mean, like, it's crystal clear, right? That it is black and blue. Yes?
Actually, I don't think it is. I think it's black and grey. But anyway.
All right. So you're seeing something completely different, right? So now those people who are seeing white and gold, what are you going to say to those ones who see black and blue? They are crazy, right? That is crystal clear, yes. And I have that. Pardon? Depends what you're looking at. So what are you seeing? Oh, so you're seeing something something completely different. Now, isn't that amazing? This is a dress, yes? And some people see black and blue, and some people are seeing white and gold, and some people see both. Now, how is that possible, right? Now, I have typically students getting to the point where they're fighting with each other. And I invite you to consider this is how we are getting conflict and how we are getting wars in the worst case scenario. That some of us, we're looking at exactly the same thing, but we're seeing something completely different. And we are not aware of that typically. We are saying, well, of course it is black and blue. How stupid, you're colorblind, right? But both of you are right. So those people who are seeing white and gold, typically you're filling in the background with different colors based on your conditioning. Those people who are seeing white and gold, black and blue, different coloring in of the background, which means, as a well-known George Gregory said, a well-known British thinker, we see what our brain sees. We are actually not seeing what is there. We are seeing what we see is based on more than 90% of our memory. 90%. So strictly speaking, we are seeing less objectively. What's out there is 10%. Mind-boggling, right? I hope that works. Typically, it works a bit. So basically, what that should be a video occurring, and I hope it does. Sometimes it gets a bit stuck. So yeah, but whilst this is loading, hopefully.
Let's go and see.
So I invite you to consider really that. Again, you're not seeing what's really out there, and different people are seeing different things based on their background, on their education, on their life experiences, on the media, all of those things. And what you're making out of it, how you're interpreting it, you're seeing different things, right? So there is actually no such thing as an objective true reality out there. It is different for all of us. So what I would have, if the video would be working, you would see young people passing the ball to each other, And I would have asked you to count how often they are passing the ball to each other. And then I would have asked you how many times, and some of you would have said 13 times. And I would have said, yeah, absolutely. And did you see the moonwalking bear? And it's very obvious. And then I reply the whole thing for you. And people will say, well, no, of course not, you know. And then you will see the moonwalking bear. And you did not see that bear. And you could have, it's like a, you know, it's like a man in bear costume. And you think like sitting there, well, how could I miss it? How on earth could I miss it? It's plain there. Once you know, you see it. There's no mistaking. Which brings home, what we see is actually what we're paying our attention to. So not only are we filling in based on our memory, what we are seeing, but we are actually also only seeing what we're focusing on, exactly as we are narrowing down. And our brain tells us to narrow down, but also I would have told you to focus on a certain thing, right? And then you are zooming in on that certain thing because I told you. Now, same with society. Society is telling you this exists and that doesn't exist. And over time you come believe it, and then you are conditioned to focus on certain things and you completely don't see other things. So really, really interesting in that, because then you come to the point where, oh my God, what am I not seeing? But it's actually there. And it becomes habitual, right? It's just how it is. Same with our worldview. This worldview, which is destroying the world, is basically become habitual. And the worldview, which is actually looking after country and has the answers for all of our existential crises, we are destroying. And in the Western culture, we already have largely destroyed it. So to take care of the environment and to save the environment and to answer to all of those existential crises, the source is that. And so what we need to do is we need to go back and shift that from this damaging worldview to this life-giving worldview. Now, luckily, all of those crises are actually forcing us to do that because they're becoming too painful. So the question then is, those crises are triggering this transformative learning because they're pushing people to shift, because things are collapsing and not working. Now, how? So there's a couple of theories out there which together basically say that how we deal with the world as people is that we constantly assign those meanings. We constantly basically not see what is there, but we interpret what's there. And then we interact based on those meanings. And then we come up with, invent and share those stories to organize those events over time. And those stories typically on which we are basing our actions are very useful. However, sometimes they are not. I'll actually go over that. So then when there is unfamiliar events such as a crisis, right? Our habitual ways of doing things are not working anymore. And we are all experiencing that now because the world is collapsing, right, as we know it. And we are all like, well, what do we do now? So we are being basically pushed to shift and to change our stories. And so it creates this disorienting, what transformative learning says, it's disorienting dilemmas. Our old ways of seeing things and doing things are no longer working, but we don't know the new ones either. But we have to come up with something. So then in this space, new stories can emerge. And then they are accepted and people can make sense and perceive those new stories as relevant and useful. So that creates then spaces for people and communities and societies to create new ways of being, knowing, and doing. And this is exactly what those crises are doing for us. So they're actually good. I know it's still painful, but they're actually good because they're forcing us to shift. The question is how much longer, or how much do we need to shift? Because human beings also have this strange habit that we can actually endure a lot of pain, but we are damaging the environment and losing the environment. So then the question becomes, can we deliberately create those transformations so that we don't have to go into all of those painful experiences? So transformative learning can actually be stimulated in many different ways through rational processes such as critically examining, reflecting, questioning, and revising our perceptions. And pathways for that are decolonizing and indigenizing education research, nature-based and critical pedagogy and research, transformative education, and obviously that's important, nature-based critical perspectives twice. But then there are also those extra rational ways of knowing which are even more powerful because they are symbolic, imaginative, creative. And this is typically those ones which we have been pushing aside. And that is nature, arts and humanities, learning indigenous knowledges and sensitivities, and meditation and ancient healing systems. And those transformative learning pathways can help us restoring living connected and in harmony with nature, which means then restoring our resilience and mental health, but also people looking better after nature. So we can learn from indigenous peoples worldwide because if you think about it, they are the key to our survival, really, because they still, particularly in the north, have a lot of ancient laws and knowledges. And they are living still very much connected and in a harmonious relationship with nature, self, and others, which in the West we largely have lost. And really that indigenous peoples are still here in the face of all of those colonization strategies is for me is a miracle and really testimony for indigenous peoples being tremendously resilient. So working then, or those indigenous worldviews, knowledges, and practices are really the key for our survival and thriving. And indeed, younger Porter actually said that indigenous tribes across Australia have stories of past Armageddons, warning against the behaviors that make those difficult to survive, and offering a blueprint for transitional ways of being so that our custodial species can continue to keep creation in motion. So not only have indigenous peoples tremendous deep knowledges of nature, but also actually of how to transition. And if you think about it, indigenous peoples, at least over 65,000 years, have needed to respond to a lot of change. So of course, they would also have a lot of knowledge about how to navigate this. The indigenous and Western peoples working together two-way is actually critical and essential to ensuring all of our survival and thriving. And there's so much literature and increasingly literature out there from the Western perspective, but also from the indigenous perspectives. There's also more and more within academia now, there is a remembering of our Western ancient belief systems as well, of mysticism and esotericism as well. And that's really growing. So our liberation from the colonizing predominant Western worldview and systems is creating the crisis, and they are intertwined. And so working with indigenous peoples is really not to help them, but actually to help us, because our liberation is tied up with indigenous peoples. Then we also have indigenous critical and pedagogical research and pedagogy. So research, indigenous methodologies is research by and for indigenous peoples and using their own methods drawn from their indigenous traditions and knowledges. But also in the West, we actually have critical methodologies as well, which are emancipatory, empowering, and values critical pedagogy and critical race and post-structural feminism. And this scholarship is explicitly done for political utopian purposes, the politics of liberation, for us all. It's reflexive, it's searching for open-ended, subversive, multi-voiced, participatory. So it's really working together with people, and it's breaking away from the focus and slowly and kind of the predominance of the quantitative experimental designs towards working with people together, and very often with citizens themselves, because they have the local knowledges. And that really leads to disrupting colonial and post-colonial spaces, but also creates change and justice. So it's working together. So research is increasingly working together with people themselves to make the difference. And again, there's increasingly literature out there which we can put back on, and very often, particularly also in the natural sciences, because unfortunately the different silos are not talking that much with each other. But there is qualitative and critical research has a lot of knowledge of how to actually work with people, which I think natural sciences there would be a great value if natural science could utilize those research approaches. Then we have nature-based and critical pedagogy, and I'm going a bit fast there. So this is really all to disrupt and deconstruct the cultural practices we have. So what disasters and those crises are doing is coming from this side as well to question our very Western education system, and to actually expose that it is colonizing itself, and to join forces with indigenous peoples. And it honors the experiences, knowledges of indigenous peoples and builds up on them. And also encourages processes that mobilize and transform communities at the local level. So again, it's working together with people rather than kind of having all the research done in universities away from people. And it's creating counter narratives. So there's different alternative perspectives, which gives people different ideas of actually what they can do, and exchanging them across. And we can fall back here on the romantics, on the Paulo Freire, on the pedagogy of the oppressed, Waldorf education, Rudolf Steiner forced schools. Now, all of them, if we can facilitate them in our education system more widely, we would make a big difference. Transformative education, so again, for environmental scientists, would be really useful for particularly the Edmund Sullivan's books, and he actually created a whole learning towards an ecological consciousness. And it's all based on transformative education. I don't know how much that is known in the environmental space, but highly, highly recommended. And he actually worked with indigenous peoples as well. So all of that is also created with the input from indigenous peoples. Nature, we know that increasingly there's literature in the social sciences, how humans and nature living and interacting in harmony exists across cultures, and it works in practice. It has enduring spiritual, social, ecological, and economic benefits as well. So more and more literature coming out there. And that is actually us interacting with nature is essential for our health, our well-being, our education, our development and growth. So there's immediate benefits from that. And it's also the source of individual collective adaptive capacities, which we in the disaster risk reduction space and climate adaptation space need. So by facilitating children and people in general more interacting with nature, we have all of those benefits. And indeed, we actually developed a model based on all of that, which shows that to reduce the risk of disasters and adapt to climate change, we have to live back in harmony with nature. Yeah. So again, there's lots of and increasingly knowledge there and research coming out how important it is for us human beings to interact with human nature, and if we don't, a lot of our physical and psychological issues occur. So again, it's rather than looking at the symptoms and trying to fix the symptoms, to say, okay, this is actually the source, and this is how we can change or shift the source. children growing up in nature, right, makes such a difference, but how often does it now happen anymore, unfortunately? And do people's, children still, play in trees? Oh no, they could fall down and then they could, stuff happen. We cocoon children. This is how children learn to, get to know themselves and become confident. All of those things, right? Or to explore nature. And like I remember as a child, I could spend hours just basically exploring nature. Now we're giving children plastic toys, right? So all of that can, and again, there is heaps and heaps of literature, and there's biophilia we know, but eco-psychology is now growing. It's more and more also ecotherapy now, we call it, or nature-based therapy is happening as well. But it is, what I'm saying here is there's more and more now of knowledge and research coming out that nature is essential for us, for our health and well-being. So now if we can, again, as environmental scientists, work with that, I think there could be a lot more happening. Art is another thing, which is absolutely transformative. It creates opportunities for challenging and existing perspectives and considering new perspectives. And it creates alternative realities as well. Again, transformative, right? It challenges perspectives to selves in the world we are conditioned into, like I did with you when I challenged you with the TESS, right? So once there's then alternative realities emerge, it's difficult to go back. Now you know about the TESS, and hopefully that that will live with you forever and will make a big difference in how you're living your life. Great thing about art and using arts, for example, also as environmental scientists, is it's universal. It's transcending, it doesn't need any language, and people naturally engage with it across all of cultures. It's experiential as well. People assist people from diverse cultural backgrounds, realizing that their commonalities, bringing them back together and celebrating the diversity, but also actually we are all the same, so transcending cultural differences. So there are very effective pathways also for connecting people from different cultures and facilitating collaborating, which we need for collective action. Yeah, it's a catalyst for collective and systems transformation as well. We are talking so much about systems transformation. Art is a tremendously effective pathway for that. For all of those reasons. And it really promotes individual and groups connecting, considering, exploring, reflecting, and dialoguing in a safe space. And that is so important because that's where authentic conversations are occurring. Helps problem solving as well. So it's really art creates new ways of looking at problems and new ways of seeing, seeking answers to those problems. And Indigenous artists lead the way there tremendously as well. And that's a Taiwanese friend of ours. And also because Indigenous art, in what we're calling art, this is actually where the knowledge is at many, many different deep layers. It's not just like art as we know in the Western culture. It is actually a mode of encoding all the knowledge. So there is then an argument to be made for reconnecting science and arts, which would make a big difference. And there is precedence for that as well, as we know with Leonardo da Vinci, which used that work across all of those different fields very effectively. There's also transpersonal psychology now coming out, which I think we can use for creating those shifts as well. Because they are transforming the whole person in intimate relationships with diverse, interconnected, and evolving worlds, and including also with nature. And then there's meditation, which is actually really, really important in ancient healing systems. There is a reasons why across the world, in the different different parts of the world, meditation plays a huge, always has and always will play a huge role in different particular expressions, but meditation nevertheless. And it's really meditation gives this space of connecting with ourselves, with our inner being, but also with the larger, wider cosmos. And this one is a particular good one because Yogananda shared all of the Indian very amazing and profound thousands of years old healing systems and meditation system with the West, and adjusted it to the West. So transformative learning is really the answer, and can really transform the source, help us to go back so that we can move forward, but also to go within. And there's many different pathways we can use, which we can use individually and can use combined to shift and take away the source of the existential crises, and to shift to a worldview which can which is really the antidote and will create amazing solutions to our existential crises, so that we can shift and break free from all the checkers we have, and from destroying our world to actually creating a world in which we are all healthy and thriving, and not only us as human beings, but nature as well. There's a couple of, all of those ones basically are in those publications. So if you're interested in the details, I know I rushed through the whole thing, but if you're interested, you can find them online. All of those publications going more into the depth of it. And we have a new one coming out as well. So with the Wakanunganua team, so that's the team of indigenous peoples up in the north, where we are working on regenerating the existence of life. Big, ambitious goal, but that's what the indigenous people say we not only can do, but which we need to, so that we are all surviving. Thank you.
Very much, Petra. So questions? We may also have some online questions as well. I think people are sort of digesting and cogitating over a lot of things you said. I am. Yeah. Sure.
I'm interested why there is this necessary dichotomy between patriarchal and matriarchal when it comes to the nurturing aspects and the destructive aspects. So why this has to be assigned to a gender, and what if you could just
what's your understanding when you're saying dichotomy of matriarchy? What's your understanding of market?
Well, I'm coming from a completely different angle, and that's why I'm asking this question. So it's probably one of the slides that's triggered me to ask this question, where there was a whole list of attributes with titled by or headed by patriarchy, and then a whole list of attributes headed by matriarchy. And because I personally would not make that distinction, because I consider myself a socialized man, but I also I don't see myself as someone who's a supporter of the system as it is, with the worldview that is quite destructive. And it's for me, this is a bit like that's why I need some.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying it. No, it's really good, because that gives me the opportunity to say.
So sorry, maybe just to finish this off, I see that me as a man, I also have the capacity to embrace and to act out all these attributes that were put on this matriarchy side, and I claim them for myself because I'm a human.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much for that, because I invite you to consider so I basically gave you the extreme sides, right? Now there is a shade, it's a continuum, there's a complete shade, and we are all in different spaces along that. But also what we often misinterpret is that patriarchy is the male and matriarchy is the female. But matriarchy is actually the balance of male and female working together. And that balance again has been gone out. If you not look at you as an individual, so you, it's fantastic. You having that within you individually, you have that balance. Now that balance is what we need in the world. Can you see what I mean? Does it make sense? That is exactly right. And again, you know, because very often people mistake matriarchy for or female coming back, and it's the female side. It's not. It's the balance of the masculine and the feminine, and the masculine and feminine working together, and working together in a way where each of them actually honors their respective gifts. You know, there's a reason why Indigenous peoples have men's business and women's business. And and again, they need to be in harmony, none of them being, you know, better or worse or stronger or weaker. They need to be in balance to work. Again, it's this harmony in all of those aspects. And then if you can accomplish that, then we will create a society which actually works. Make sense?
Go ahead. Just ask your question.
Yeah.
Sorry. If you're going to ask a question, I'll ask a question, but it comes in. So this is. And we will have, we'll have
That's okay. That's okay. That's good.
Thank you.
Otherwise, it doesn't get recorded.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
right.
Yeah.
So following on from the colleague just now, I will also freely admit that I had in parts a visceral reaction to your talk, and I'd like to very respectfully, but nevertheless in parts strongly disagree. Whereas in other parts, I think we're aligned in terms of the diagnosis. I think part of the problem is that you implicitly rail against dichotomies, yet at the same time, as the colleague has pointed out, you put up these dichotomies. You know, we've got those damn males that with their colonization destroy the bloody world and they lead to all the evils in the world, as opposed to, So following your argument just now, and you've explained what you meant, it seems like we have a terminology and a semantic issue, if indeed what
representative issue. I should have it as a continuum.
But that's not the argument that I actually wanted to make. The argument I actually wanted to make is, and I wanted to stand up a little bit for Western culture and actually try and ask whether we really need to go, and this is not a commentary on indigenous knowledge systems, but whether a lot of the things that you're asking for aren't actually already implicit in Western culture and thinking, but that they have fallen victim to what you in a half sentence called polemicization. So you blamed a lot of the deficiencies in Western culture on Plato and Aristotle. Yeah? Plato and Aristotle, unlike you asserted, did not actually separate intellect from body or intellect from nature. Aristotle argued that everything in nature moves towards a certain telos, and that at the end there was an unmovable mover, and that basically orchestrated things, and that it was the role of the intellect to understand the movement towards that telos. And so, if you will, engaging in intellectual exercise for Aristotle was a spiritual exercise, and he believed in some form of natural spirituality. Plato, the same thing. I mean, Plato, Höhlengleichnis, parable of the cave. He said there were certain universals that existed, and the application of reason is there to determine what these universals are, because in many ways the universals are actually more real than the world that we perceive. Similar to your argument. If you don't want to go quite as far back, the much reviled, Heidegger talked about what technology was doing to us, and that it was creating a disconnect between technique, technology, spirituality, and an experience of the world. And more recently, and again, breaking a lance for Christianity, a reformational philosopher like Hermann Dooyeweerd, in his 15 modal aspects, would have argued that experienced human reality is at minimum a compound of 15 viewpoints, saying there's probably more, but the 15 he came up with, it was an experience of space, extension, dimensionality, kinematics, so that's the physical world, an experience of the biotic, that's the living world, and then he goes on to an experience of the aesthetic, the just, and finally the pistic, i.e. belief systems.
We'll have to sort of bring that.
Sorry. But so this is my defense at an end. But what I'm trying to say to you is, I think a lot of the things that you're asking for are already implicit in Western thinking, but may have fallen victim to the polemics of the Enlightenment. So, isn't the real question? Do we really need to turn to indigenous knowledge systems, or do we actually? How do we bring back, if you will, that voice of the West that was always there?
But that's exactly what I'm saying. Bringing back and going back to this voice, but it's those kernels. I should have, and thanks for pointing that out, said it's the predominant Western worldview. Because what you're saying is absolutely, it's there, and it's in all of those, not only in the German philosophers, but also in many more philosophers, it is there, but it's those kernels, but it's not the dominant Western worldview. And it's the dominant Western worldview which is creating that society and culture which we have now. So it's exactly that what I'm saying, going back to all of those ones who actually had those. But having said that, though, many of them kind of interpreted the ancient wisdom, which is very much like the indigenous wisdom is universal and it's unchangeable. But they changed it slightly. So what I'm saying is, like indigenous peoples going back to the original one, go back to our original Western one. Okay. And I think that's then we can agree. Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
Great.
Any other questions?
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I love it.
Petra, I might just have one. So as you spoke and you painted this sort of picture and narrative, I felt a little bit like there was essentially a romanticism or over-romanticism of indigenous peoples. And I mean, as guardians, as saviors of ecosystems and environments. And I think most people, I would think most archaeologists, people who have studied, cultural anthropologists and others who've studied many of these groups, they would say a lot of things about them. And they certainly wouldn't dispute the fact that there's a lot of indigenous knowledge. But the notion that somehow, well, let's just say that many of them would say you can find many examples. I mean, just look around the world from the last 50,000 years. Indigenous peoples, spread of indigenous peoples has wiped out the megafauna all over the planet. That's been absolutely correlated with everywhere from New Zealand, where you were, to Europe, to everywhere else, you know what I mean? Except for to a lesser degree in Africa. So that's happened. And there's been, Jared Diamond and Collapse talked about Mesoamerica, that type of thing. So I guess I would challenge you a bit on this notion that there's this kind of universal smiling, happy face that somehow has the word indigenous associated with it, and that it's fundamentally different from other kinds of knowledge systems, or at least I'd like to hear you defend the view that we need to embrace this as a very serious, it sounds to me, construct for how we're going to behave in the world. Okay.
I would argue, so I would counter argue there, from how do we know? Because also, if you just look at the first contact in Australia between indigenous peoples and the explorers or the missionaries, we are basically the knowledge we are having and basing our knowledge of indigenous cultures on is very much our interpretation of indigenous knowledge systems from the perspective of the explorers. So it's basically mainly second-hand. But if you think about it, they couldn't talk with each other. And I would also argue to a large degree, particularly also those Western, they had their own interests. They had the mining, the settlement interests, all of those ones. And they also were shaped by social Darwinism at the time, which placed indigenous peoples as primitive, right? that's what they brought to the conversation. And there wasn't really much conversation. And indigenous peoples couldn't get through either, because indigenous peoples didn't know the white man's language, right? So what I'm saying there is, how do we know? How do we
know what?
You know, how do we know that all of those damages, what you talked, really occurred? And how do we really know what those knowledge systems were? Well, from where I'm coming from is, if you're living in Australia, right, if you're just looking from the Australian indigenous perspective, and I'm very aware that I'm as a non-indigenous person to Australia, speaking about that now, and I'm aware that indigenous peoples are in the room here, so forgive me if that's my perspective. If something works for at least 65,000 years, there must be something very, very special to that, right? It didn't work?
Well, there was mass extinctions. Yeah, the mass extinctions. They wiped out much of the biodiversity of Australia.
How do we know that indigenous peoples wiped out those
Because it's core. Oh, there's so much evidence. It's not even close anymore. Is a huge scientific consensus on this view. When you look across the whole South Pacific, you look at New Zealand. I mean, we could just tick off Madagascar, one landmass after another, and the mass extinctions of the large species, typically over 50 kilograms, coincide almost perfectly, but in a snapshot in real time, with the mass overhunting. And a lot of these things are large. They reproduce slowly. They don't reproduce till they get older in life. So you go in and you suddenly have this big increase in mortality of the adults or whatever. And these are very easy things to drive extinct if they're under enough pressure. So it's very clear. There's no doubt about this. This needs to be embodied in your, I would think, in this romanticized view of indigenous peoples to reflect a more realistic view. And we're not saying that they haven't learned a lot of things in 65,000 years. And my goodness me, you know, or whether the early colonists were, you know, quite ignorant in a lot of ways. I don't think anybody disputes that. But the very romantic, what I would suggest is romanticized view of the noble savage, I think is just outdated now. I don't think too many people would adhere to that myself.
Yeah. So that's the first time I'm hearing, right? So thanks for bringing that to my attention. Now I then would need to look deeper into. So there's a correlation, but still, how do we know? Because none of us lived at that time.
Oh, this has been so extensively debated. There's many scientific papers published in the top journals. Recent syntheses and stuff have come out now and said, look, it's not even a question. There was some people saying, because it's become so trendy to talk about climate change, they're trying to invoke some kind of climate factors, you know, changing into the ice age, that type of thing. And they just said the numbers just, I can send you several things that will show you.
I love to.
And you could talk to amongst the authors of the books that you featured. You're certainly not going to get Jared Diamond disagreeing with me. You can read the book, The Future Eaters, about Australia. That's one that would really be important to read because it documents a lot of these changes and coincident with that, with Aboriginal
love to
colonization. Yeah,
So
sure.
if you can give that to me, that would be awesome. Thank you. I mean, like, I'm evolving too.
Well, you must have known and suspected a little bit when you came in and talked to a really different audience like this. You were going to get some.
You know, this is what I'm on about. The more we are talking across those different disciplines, and obviously there's philosophy here, I don't know, you know, and environmental. Typically, we don't have those cross-pollination, and if we have them, then we come to those amazing conversations. And I think this is where the gold is. Because we have now so much knowledge in those different areas, but not across them. And as soon as we talk across, you know, then we can, as long as we stay open-minded, learn from each other and revise as we go along, right?
Yeah. Petra, we'll go ahead and bring this to a close if you don't mind. Bob, sorry, I think we need to close it down. What time is it right now? 1:15? Oh, well, we'll let Bob get a question here.
Very generous, Bill. Thank you so much. Yeah, look, I mean, I think Bill's right about the megafauna. I'd put one small twist on that. There is some evidence in Australia that there was a climate shift at about the same time of the extinction. And it looks like it might have been a climate was changing, but the coup de grace was by people.
Yeah.
And, you know, so there was a combination of events. Elsewhere, it's probably a different story. And I'd be very careful of Jared Diamond. I mean, a lot of what he wrote is complete. It's complete rubbish. It really is.
Yeah.
And I mean, in fact, there was a book published from a conference after Diamond's book came out at Cambridge, which was entitled Collapse. What collapse? They're still there. They just changed, you know. And so, you know, I'd be very careful about him, but many others are not. My question is this. What you're talking about is transformative education, but you're up against power. You're up against massive power, which I think is, I mean, thanks for the clarification about what matriarchy is to you. I hadn't appreciated that, but I'd say the power is in the hands of the patriarchy, and it is not going away anytime soon. Just have a look at the United States.
Yes, however, kind of putting maybe absolutely, and this is where I think, for the better or worse, there's all of this existential crisis, and particularly the disasters, which are becoming more and more damaging and compounding, actually help us.
So this is consistent with the disaster idea that never waste a good disaster.
Yeah, no, because it can't sustain itself any longer, or much longer, because it is really spiraling out, and with each more disasters, not only is it challenging all the systems and making the systems break, but also it's waking people up. Because if you look at the literature after disasters, what typically happens for people is they are starting to question, why is it happening? They're starting to re-evaluate what's really important in life, and then they're starting to shift actually away from the materialistic, more towards relationships, towards developing themselves, all of those things. They're also going in within and saying, well, how do I need to develop myself so that if something like this happens again, I can be stronger in that. It brings communities together, because that's the only way in which we can basically provide an answer to those challenging crises, that we need to come together, because they are too large for one person to respond to. Again, that's a good thing. So yes, and Trump, from my perspective, does an amazing job of actually amplifying what's not working. So it becomes more like it's not gray, and you can't say, oh, well, you know, it kind of works and doesn't work. But because he is so much black, shall we say, right? And again, I know that's very oversimplifying it, but it basically, he amplifies it so much that people are saying, no, that is definitely not working, right? And then again, but people start, you know, the support is dwindling, scientists are banding together, all of those things. So you know, I know if I wouldn't have the optimism there, I think I probably wouldn't be here anymore. But I really do think, you know, if you see it from a bit of a large bird's view, maybe I should say, at that deep time within and large bird view, it's actually, it's either it's making us or it's breaking us.
Okay, well, Petra, thank you very much. That was one of the most thought-provoking talks we have had in a long time. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Thank you very much for coming and visiting us.
Thank you so much. I've actually forgot. Thank you so much for being here and engaging so much as well. I really appreciate it, and for being authentic in your responses and your questions as well. Thanks.